Our next presentation is from, starting with the State Auditor's Office related to the audit of federal dollars that came in during COVID to Washington State. And Scott, I'll turn it over to you to introduce your team. And then Ross Hunter, the Secretary of DCYF, Department of Children, Youth, and Families, is also here, and he would like a few minutes at the end of your presentation. So I'm going to keep track of time so that we can allow him a chance to respond and inform.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I'm feeling like it's a conspiracy that we have to follow the pretty pictures with auditing.
That's why I put the pretty pictures first.
Indeed. I'm Scott Nelson, Director of Legislation and Policy for State Auditor Pat McCarthy. With me today is Jim Brunell, the Assistant Director of State Audit and Special Investigations, and Kevin Bush, our Single Audit Manager. We appreciate the opportunity to share our work. This year, Washington's federal audit received a lot more media attention than usual. We've always been ready to discuss our work. What we found this year largely was not new. There was some discussion of whether our audit findings were related to COVID-19. Some of them are. Many of them are not. Many of them are long-standing issues that merit your attention. In general terms, the audit we are about to present is a report to the federal government on whether or not, in our professional opinion, Washington state agencies met the requirements set out in their federal grants. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jim to present the report.
All right, thank you, Scott. Good morning. Jim Brunell, Assistant Director of State Audit and Special Investigations. So our audit of Washington's federal spending is federally mandated. We refer to it as the SWISA, or the Statewide Single Audit, and I'll be using that acronym this morning. And we want to make it clear this is distinct from our audit of the basic financial statements that we also do annually. So that's known as the ACFR. So this is a separate engagement. So state law requires the Office of the Washington State Auditor to conduct this audit. And in terms of budgeted hours, it's the largest engagement we do every year. And it's about 30,000 billable hours to complete the single audit for Washington. So this audit answers 4 very important questions. And those are, were federal funds spent properly and adequately supported? Did our state agencies have adequate internal controls over federal compliance requirements? Did the state comply with certain federal laws and regulations, state and federal? And did the state comply with special grant requirements that some of our grantors include in their grant agreements with Washington State? So this chart shows you a history of Washington's federal spending over the last 5 years. And you can see from 2017 to 2019, we're fairly stable, around $17 billion annually of federal spending. And then the pandemic hit in 2020. And as you can see, our federal spending increased to about $26 billion that year. The most significant increases that year were due to the unemployment insurance program, some spending from the coronavirus relief fund, and also the education stabilization fund. And then 2021, our federal spending continued to increase to just under $37 billion. UI, or unemployment insurance spending, was significantly higher than normal years. We had increases in spending for the coronavirus relief fund, the education stabilization fund, and new spending from the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery fund, Medicaid, and other new federal programs. So as it relates to specific COVID-19 relief, in fiscal year 21, our state spent $17.6 billion in COVID-19 related federal money. $2 billion of that was passed on to what we call subrecipients. So for instance, local governments or nonprofit organizations. So our presentation today is focused on the results of our most current audit that covered fiscal year 21. And as I said before, our state in total spent $37 billion of federal funding. Our audit covered $31.6 billion of those funds. So what is reported as findings in a single audit is actually in federal law. There are 4 particular things that we normally report on, and those are significant or material internal control weaknesses or deficiencies, material non-compliance with grant requirements. At times, we find what are referred to as question costs that Kevin will define for you in a moment. And we are required by law to report a finding if we identify $25,000 or more in a particular grant as a finding. And also, if we identify as the auditor's fraud during an audit related to a federal program that has not already been reported to the federal government, we also have to write an audit finding. State agencies are required to submit corrective action plans as part of the audit process, and those are filed with the Office of Financial Management here in Washington. So with that, Kevin's going to discuss the more specific audit details.
Thank you. So you'll see here the audit results. This year there were 25 federal programs that we audited. 21 of them received a finding, at least one finding. We had a total of 61 findings issued, and out of those, 11 were related to COVID-19 programs. We had $724 million in known question costs and $299 million in likely question costs. And we question costs in compliance with federal regulations. They define what is a question cost. These are expenditures that resulted from a violation of a provision of a law or other grant requirement, cost which was not supported by adequate documentation, or a cost that was incurred that appeared unreasonable and did not reflect the actions a prudent person would take under the circumstances. The likely question cost number is generated when we do our testing. We attempt to do statistically valid sampling whenever possible. That is the majority of our testing. When we identify question costs through that method, we are then able to project those costs to the entire population being tested to come up with an estimate of question costs. So our responsibility in this audit is to issue opinions about whether the state materially complied with federal requirements and internal controls over compliance for each program individually. Some types of audit opinions that we issue are unmodified opinions, adverse, and disclaimer of opinion. The unmodified is referred to as a clean audit opinion. That is the majority of the programs that we audit. 20 of the 25 programs this year received unmodified opinions. We issue adverse opinions when noncompliance and internal control deficiencies are material and pervasive. We had 3 programs that received an adverse opinion this year. And lastly, we disclaim on issuing an opinion when we are unable to gather sufficient audit evidence to state whether we believe compliance occurred. And this type of opinion is extremely rare. So I'd like to talk about a few programs this year and the results. First is the Coronavirus Relief Fund. We did work at 3 separate agencies. We issued 5 findings, 2 to the Department of Commerce, 2 to DSHS, and 1 to the Office of Financial Management. The issues that we identified in for this program were primarily inadequate monitoring of subrecipients and inadequate support for the reports that were filed with the federal government regarding that spending. We questioned over $4 million in program costs. The next program that we issued an adverse opinion for is the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. 3 findings were issued in this program, 2 to the Department of Agriculture and 1 to the Department of Corrections. We also did work at UW, at the University of Washington for this program, but they had no issues reported. The issues that we identified in the finding include payments for costs that occurred outside of the fund's period of performance timeframe, and procurement issues and inadequate subrecipient monitoring. We specifically found vendors that were provided funds without proper contracts in place, and payments or awards to subrecipients were non-compliant with federal law, and risk assessments were not performed in many cases for those subrecipients, which is also a federal requirement. We questioned a total of $31 million in this, for this program. And the third adverse opinion we issued was for the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. We did work for this at the Department of Children, Youth, and Families and at the Department of Social and Health Services. We identified 3 findings, 2 of which were at the department at DSHS and 1 for DCYF. The issues we found at DSHS were less significant. They did not materially comply with the special requirement that they have tied to the child support program. And then another finding was issued related to tracking of allocation of payroll. The third finding is the reason for the adverse opinion, and that was the finding issued to DCYF and included all but 142 of those $119 million that were questioned. And that finding, the basis for that finding is, I'm going to elaborate on the next slide. It's related to the disclaimer of opinion that we issued for the Child Care Development Fund and the work at DCYF. This is the first time we've disclaimed on a program since 2003. As I said, that this is a rarity. The reason for this disclaimer is that the accounting records maintained by DCYF to support payments for child care were not auditable. This is due to a change in accounting practices where the agency is transferring costs at a fund level instead of a payment level by the child payment. And this is important for two reasons. First, it is required by federal law, by the grantor. And second, without accounting for payments at the transaction level, there's not enough clarity in the accounting records to evidence federal requirements, such as period of performance, matching, earmarking, reporting, and the allowability of the payment itself. Prior to this change, the department, and formerly the Departments of Early Learning and DSHS, had sufficient records to show funding sources that paid for each payment. I do want to point out that while this is a new issue, there have been issues with the CCDF program since 2005. We have issued payments related to oversight of child care payments since then. We've issued findings related to eligibility since 2012 and findings related to a special test regarding health and safety requirements since 2015. This condition accounted for $271 million of the $293 million that we questioned, and this is a $327 million program, so it's the bulk of the program costs, and was also the cause of the TANF finding because the TANF funding is also applied to child care payments. So the payments that go out have multiple funding sources, including both federal programs as well as state dollars. So for the audit as a whole, the most common types of significant problems we found include improper unsupported payments that accounted for 21 of the 61 findings, insufficient monitoring of subrecipients, and these subrecipients, as Jim had mentioned earlier, typically are local governments, nonprofit organizations, and the state agency passes the federal funds to those agencies to help manage the federal program and oftentimes disperse funds. And that accounted for 15 of the findings that we issued. Special tests and provisions. So as is mentioned, this audit is done strictly to federal regulations, and the grantor has the ability to add special tests and provisions, they're called, and they direct auditors to test those, so we are required to examine those. We found 15 instances this year where those requirements were not being met. And lastly, inadequate reporting. And the primary issues with those tend to be inaccuracy, incompleteness, or not adequately supported. So our report was issued on August 8th. It is available on both our website and OFM's website. We have also published an infographic summary report to summarize the results. Includes many of the visuals you've seen in today's presentation. And that is intended to help give an overview. Without this report is well over 1,000 pages, so helps to summarize. So what happens next? After findings are issued, the federal government, the grantor agency, is required to follow up and issue a management decision for each of the audit findings. And then these decisions are sent to the department or OFM, or sometimes both. For findings that identify known question costs, the federal agency may request repayment. If that occurs, the department is provided the chance to provide additional documentation, and essentially it can be a negotiation process to come to a final dollar amount to be repaid, if any. Federal regulations also require us to follow up on all findings that are issued in the prior year. We do that in every audit. And our single audit for fiscal year 2022 is underway. We started that in around June, and we expect that that report will be issued on June 30th of 2023. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to present the results of our audit today, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. I saw Senator Van de Weeg had a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that $17.6 billion was spent in COVID funds in the fiscal year, and then $2 billion was passed on to local governments. When is that $2 billion? Because I gather that wasn't part of this audit. When is the $2 billion going to be audited that went to local governments?
That $2 billion is audited when we visit the local governments that receive that funding. So our office also conducts audits of the local governments, so that'll be on their audit cycle whenever that occurs.
Any other questions? Senator Wilson and then Senator Braun.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess my concern here is, of course, the money that maybe have to be returned to the Fed. So how deep do you go in these? Where do we know granularly where exactly that money went and to whom? I would assume that we wouldn't be requesting it back from individuals, but of course, if we have the $2 billion and the local governments received it, I would assume that you would probably try to claw that back to return. Where are we on that? How does that work?
Well, please keep in mind, our responsibility as the auditor is to make statements in our judgment and our opinion about whether states complied. And what our report says this year is we were unable to audit those transactions. So we don't have any audit documentation or work to substantiate whether those payments were allowable or not, hence the disclaimer. So if the federal government decides to seek repayment, it will be contacting DCYF. As Kevin described, there might be a negotiation process. The department would have opportunity to provide documentation to support those payments that the federal government might accept. Does that answer your question? Kind of? All right. Well, it's hard to predict, frankly, what the federal government will do. There have been instances that certain grantors have requested repayment of known question costs. This year we're talking about a significant amount of money. So we don't know from our past experience whether they will seek full recovery.
Senator Braun.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So obviously this is pretty concerning. My question is, in your report or in any other method, do you provide any suggestions on legislative action that could address either the shortfall in information that caused some of the concerns, or how do we address this legislatively in a way that's productive for this case and future cases like it?
Are you speaking specifically about the adverse or the disclaimer of opinion for DCYF? Or the audit as a whole?
Well, I was speaking more broadly, but certainly that's one of the issues.
All right. So our recommendations are directed to the agencies responsible for managing that program. And we, in our audit report, have no recommendations that we feel were necessary to make to the legislature. We do feel that agencies have the ability to, dedicate resources and comply. If you look at the responses that the agencies wrote to the findings, you might see where they feel the causes were and whether they feel legislative action might be necessary.
It's worth adding, if I may quickly, that the client here is the federal government, essentially. We're responding to their documentation and their standards, and so it's not structured really to be a guidepost for you. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
We have a couple more questions. I want to ask Secretary Hunter to make his way up here, and in the meantime, Senator Conway.
Thank you for the report. I haven't had a chance to review the report. Some of this may be in. Do you have a pie chart? You know, I know Employment Security Department probably got a lion's share of federal dollars coming into the state through its unemployment insurance programs. Do you have a pie chart that shows the distribution of where the federal funds were at?
We certainly do. In our infographic on our website, we have a chart with all of the programs and every agency that received the funds.
And do you chart the unspent money as well as the spent money in that chart?
We do not. We just audit what was spent.
So do we have any analysis of how much of this money is unspent at this point?
We do not. I believe OFM would be best to provide you that information.
Thank you.
Senator Hasagawa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I was curious, you made a sort of a quick comment about the UW having no issues, that it was fine, but my understanding is that they use a different accounting system that's non-standard, and I was told that it was nearly impossible to interpret what they were doing, and that it would take close to a decade to figure it out. So I'm wondering how in a year you're able to discern that there's no issues there.
So we have a long-standing process with the University of Washington to receive their data. I am not involved in that particular process, but we do obtain their expenditure data at a level that we are able to audit to. Have not had the particular issues that you're referring to for this audit, at least.
Okay. All right, thank you for your presentation.